Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards.
If you're listening to this podcast, then you're in great company. We've got thousands of listeners who have a thirst for continual improvement and raising standards in business. Whether your interest is in quality, sustainability, or risk standards, I'd love to welcome you as a member to our online platform for all things ISO, the ISology Hub. The ISology Hub is the leading place to get access to all of your online resources, from in-depth training courses through to our very popular coffee break training, to templates and action plans and many other resources to help raise standards. As a member, you get access to over 100 courses, taking you from learner to practitioner to leader. The ISology Hub has all the resources that you need, which will really help to make your life easier and to help improve compliance in those business critical areas. So if you'd like access to learning and compliance resources ranging from data privacy to environmental management, anti-bribery, business continuity, quality, health and safety, to name just but a few, the list is endless actually, then we'd love you to come and join us. Just head over to the isologyhub.com.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the ISO Show. I'm Ian Battersby. I'm a senior ISO consultant at Blackmores UK Limited. Today, I'm going to talk about a topic that's important to me. I find it a fascinating topic in many ways, and fascinating the way it's framed in public conversation. I'm going to argue the case for health and safety. I'm going to argue the case for strong regulation, and very importantly, enforcement in relation to the health, safety and welfare of every one of us. Interestingly, when we analyse our client needs, the demand for ISO 45001, which is the management system standard on occupational health and safety management, appears not to be growing particularly, or is not as strong as it might be for some other standards like 9001. 27,001. And it would be interesting to know why, and be interesting to explore why. It might be the type of client base we have where they feel the low risk. It might be that the appetite for health and safety management systems has weakened in the face of other standards coming along. Might be that supply chain client needs are not proposing it as a requirement at the moment. So something we could look at a little bit more. Now, health and safety gets a bad reputation, and a substantial anti-health and safety lobby has grown over time, quite interestingly. In all sorts of ways, it's in the media. Media takes a stance against health and safety quite regularly. Politicians have certain stances. Business and employer groups have perspectives on it. And there are various economic and market interest groups who also hold opinions. And many of these propose change. They propose deregulation. And then normal, everyday folk can often be heard quite regularly complaining about the health and safety police ruining their enjoyment of the village fair and things like that. And how real any of that is, I'm not that sure anymore. Every group arguing against regulation will have their own reason. Cost, it costs money to do this. Time constraints, competitiveness. People talk about bureaucracy and red tape. And there are those with fundamental differences of opinion on regulation and market freedom. But let's look at some facts and some history. I'm going to be UK focused for a moment, but there are parallels here throughout developed economies. But a little bit of history. In the UK, the Health and Safety at Work Act received its royal consent on the 31st of July, 1974. So it's known as the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. And it came into effect the following April, 1st of April 75. To an extent, it replaced and improved upon various laws covering separate industries, fragmented laws, fragmented regulatory framework covering factories, mines, quarries, agriculture, that sort of thing. And these had separate inspectorates which were supposed to oversee whether regulation was being enforced in those particular industries. And the Health and Safety at Work Act was enacted in response to a recognition that although conditions for workers had improved over the century, there was still completely unnecessary harm being caused to many people in the country's workforce. It's interesting. It's actually called the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act. Now, that etc. signifies that there are various provisions in the Act which cover not just employers and their employees, but anyone affected by an organisation's undertakings. So, for instance, members of the public. And it also applies to the self-employed and to people who own premises and that sort of thing. So it's where anybody, through their work activities, can affect anybody else. The enactment of this is also the point in time when the Health and Safety Executive, HSE, was formally established in the UK to enforce the law partly, but it also exists to provide guidance and to help everybody to understand their duties. And also, through that guidance, it's there to try and minimise its own role in enforcement. It's trying to do itself out of that specific part of its own job. The legal duty as well to collect consolidated data on workplace injuries was also established at that point. So at that point, we have almost reliable figures for the UK on accidents and deaths in the workplace. I say almost because the reporting of accidents in the workplace still leaves the responsibility to the employer to report them where they are reportable incidents. And there is a big hole there still. I do know of incidences where employers simply don't want to do it and will wriggle out of doing it by one means or another. So yes, we have from that year, from 74, 75, information on harm done to people, which is quite robust. Now, in the year to the 31st of March, 1975, when that consolidator was first recorded, there were 651 deaths in the UK while at work. That's more than 2.5 deaths in a single year per 100,000 workers. So, over a working life of up to 40 years or more for some people, your chances begin to mount if that's the number of people per 100,000 workers who are dying. Now, coming up to date, the most recent figures we have, 24-25, collected by HSE, is that 124 people died in work. Now, that's 124 too many, we'll all agree. But that's still a big improvement since the inception of the Health and Safety Executive and the Health and Safety at Work Act. The rate per 100,000 employees is now 0.37 deaths per year. The workforce has grown a bit in that time. That's why it's that figure. So a reduction of over 85%. Looking elsewhere, as a side note, okay, I did mention parallels in other countries. And the accident rates, the regulatory frameworks, the enforcement activities in different countries do vary. And I believe that in the UK, accident rates are possibly some of the best. But they are still unacceptable. Every single person has the right to go home at the end of their day's work. So, on this side note, we'll look at the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in the United States, which serves a similar purpose to the HSE. Now, they have important differences in approach and, importantly, in independence. The HSE is independent of government to an extent. It has no ministerial control over it. It's an arm's length body. It is funded by government, but that funding is protected. Whereas OSHA sits within the Department of Labour in the United States. So it has a secretary overseeing that department who is ultimately responsible for the administration. It can also be argued that the approach used by OSHA is prescriptive in setting rules, right? Whereas HSE follows a slightly different approach. It's more outcome-based principles, which are those principles which are in the Health and Safety at Work Act. That introduces the principle that we should reduce risks so far as is reasonably practicable. Okay? Some argue that this is a more sophisticated approach and produces better results. I will leave the argument to another day. But another thing, OSHA has seen its powers to intervene, investigate and enforce curtailed at times depending on what the secretary lead is for the Department of Labour. So let's look at facts, data, statistics. The US Bureau of Labour Statistics publishes fatality rates, under its census of fatal occupational injuries. Its latest data is for 2024. The 2025 stats aren't available just yet. That's later this year. In that year, there were 5,070 fatal work injuries in the United States. Now, that was down 4% from 5,283 in 2023. That is a fatal injury rate 3.3 per 100,000 full-time equivalent workers. Now, it's important here. This is clearly a higher figure than the 0.37 which we have in the UK. Right? I will come back to that figure. But it's important that the Americans are using whole-time equivalent people rather than absolute numbers of employees. And also, they have a slightly broader coverage of types of incidents. So road traffic and travel incidents as part of work are also in there. So there are differences in method of calculating it, but still there is a stark difference. And I think there's a picture there that regulation, enforcement, guidance and approach may actually play a part. Now, it's not my place to promote anything here, but I read a book some years ago by a chap called Eric Schlosser. It's called Fast Food Nation. It explores the growth of the fast food industry in the United States. And then among other things, it looks at the impact over time of the fast food industry management model of franchising and the supply chain. And that has become focused, or it did become focused, on minimizing labor costs, ultimately to the detriment of the workers and their well-being. And now the book was published in 2001. So many things may have moved on in that time, but the principle is still relevant that was described in the book. Allowing industry to set the tone for employee welfare may not produce the best outcomes. Now, let's go back further, beyond 2001, beyond 74. If we go back to the halcyon days of Victorian Britain, days of empire, it's difficult to view the common working man, woman and child, particularly, as anything other than a commodity at that time. There were philanthropic employers, mill owners, the like, the Titus Salts of this world perhaps, who could be seen to look after the welfare of their workers. But in general, it wasn't a great picture. Thousands may have died every year in industrial accidents in this era, and large-scale accidents in many industries persisted. Mining was particularly tragic. A number of examples. The Oaks Colliery explosion in 1866 killed 360 men and boys. Hartley Colliery in 1862, 204 miners were trapped and died after a shaft collapse. Individual deaths from falls, explosions, equipment failures were fairly constant and attracted little attention from the outside world. The Abercarn Colliery explosion in Monmouthshire in Wales killed 268. The Albion Colliery explosion also in Wales, another 290. These are not exceptional. If you want to go and look up stats on colliery deaths, in 19th century Britain. It's truly alarming. Over 1,000 miners a year were dying in Britain. But the figures are, alarming in other industries. Textile mills, ironworks, shipyards, construction sites had huge casualty rates. Machines had no guards. Children were routinely employed. Often they were employed because they were small enough to fit into places that adults wouldn't fit. So they were climbing inside machinery to clean it while it was still working, or inside looms. They were employed as chimney sweeps with all the consequential damage that breathing in that dust would have. Mill workers would lose fingers, hands, arms on a very irregular basis. This attracts no attention in the outside world. It was part and parcel of life. Now, the end of the Victorian era saw some attempts at regulation. People were beginning to recognise that this wasn't quite so fair, but without any real enforcement. The Factories Act, one of the first real principal pieces of regulation, didn't appear till 1933. And regulation like that was bitterly opposed by owners of mines, mills, etc. So it was a very slow-moving landscape for a very large-scale problem. But we're talking about health as well as safety, not just about the immediate harm while you're actually working. Those figures I mentioned are only related to deaths while actually working, deaths in the workplace. The broader stats, I used the phrase truly alarming, they are truly alarming for the broader stats on workplace health. This is about the harm accumulated over a lifetime of work quite often, with long-term fatal consequences. Even the non-fatal consequences are exceptionally damaging and life-changing quite often. The suffering caused to workers exposed to hazardous conditions is completely immeasurable. It's not possible to sum that up by any data. And sadly, these are, to this day, the numbers who are affected by workplace diseases and harm. They're not known. They're not shared widely in the media these days. People do hark back to when, times were dangerous and there were these huge accidents in Victorian Britain. But people are still harmed. People are still being severely affected by workplace injury. Now, I don't know why the media doesn't share facts like this. Maybe it doesn't suit anybody's arguments. If you want to talk about regulation, people are happy to decide on whether regulation is important without using the actual statistics on harm. But for long periods, the lack of regulation or enforcement has led to needless harm. So people should talk about whether that regulation is helpful. Let's look at one set of regulations in particular. Look at why there are specific regulations dedicated to the control of asbestos. Now, people know about this, but possibly don't know the ins and outs, the history of it. The dangers of working with asbestos are long known. They were recognised remarkably early. As far back as the 1890s, scientists were establishing a link between the diseases it caused and its use. Asbestosis itself was formally recognised in 1930. So a firm link was established in 1930 between the exposure to asbestos and asbestosis as a disease. This led to regulation in 1931. Okay? But that regulation only applied to people working in the asbestos textile industry. It excluded all industries where its use was widespread. Construction, shipbuilding, anybody working with insulation. They weren't included at all. And as regulations go, it was badly enforced. And that's a picture over time. People come up with a law or a regulation and they don't enforce it. Now, on the back of the use of asbestos, mesothelioma. This is a particularly specific and invariably fatal form of cancer affecting the lungs and abdomen. The connection between asbestos and mesothelioma was established in South Africa in 1960 during research in the mining communities where they were mining blue asbestos. Okay. Further research through the 1960s in the UK backed this up, provided evidence of this link. And from the mid-60s onwards, headlines were being made nationally when shipyard workers from the war era started dying in relatively large numbers. Okay? So people who worked in the shipyards 20 years before, 25 years before, were beginning to present with this disease. Unions began to lobby protections, and media coverage continued for years. Multiple cases came out across several parts of the country and in different types of industry. It was known for a long period of time that this material caused severe damage. Nevertheless, its manufacture and use continued for years. The asbestos licensing regulations in 1983 introduced licensing for the most hazardous asbestos removal work. Blue asbestos, as I mentioned, or crocidolite, was banned in 1985, followed by brown asbestos, amosite, in 86, and then white asbestos, chrysotile, remained legal until 1999. In the interim, and since then, thousands of people died and multiple legal cases ensued. And here's my point. The link between serious disease and asbestos was known in the 1890s. It was continually proven. Britain knew in 1931 that it had to act through legislation. But that legislation was weak. Didn't cover all scenarios. It didn't at the time stop any of the industries involved harming workers. And the industries involved knew of the risks, but carried on. Subsequent legal action, it's all well and good, isn't it? But the people involved should not have suffered because people knew they would suffer. 2,218 people died of mesothelioma alone in 2023. Altogether, it's estimated that workplace lung-related disease and cancers kill as many as 13,000 people a year in the UK. Several thousand people more are known to die of non-related occupational diseases each year in the country. But it's hard to say what's the real cost, as it's not even recorded on death certificates. If you die from a lung-related disease, your death certificate doesn't say that you've got that while you worked, if 20 years later you've died because of it. And in the meantime, you've suffered the effects throughout that period. And then there are debilitating effects which aren't terminal and thus just aren't recorded. There are accidents which cause amputations, fractures, damage to limbs. There are eye conditions from light sources like welding, deafness and hearing difficulties because you've worked in noisy environments without protection. Hand-arm vibration syndrome, vibration white finger, skin conditions from exposure to hazardous substances, musculoskeletal injuries, which are quite commonplace in what we deem to be low-risk industries, and the list goes on. Now, the argument against regulation, we could all probably find elements of regulation which may be a bit over the top. I'm cherry-picking those as arguments for why we shouldn't regulate on health and safety are, in my opinion, unwarranted. I'll be kind in my words. But overarching law in the UK has this principle, the as far as is reasonably practicable. And an area people challenge is, we've got to do risk assessment for this and risk assessment for that. Now let's look at the law. The Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations specifically covers this topic. Every employer shall make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to the health and safety of people employed there and people affected by it. That should be suitable and sufficient, not over the top. It should be suitable for the conditions you're working in. It goes on to say, where the employer employs 5 or more employees, they shall record the significant findings of the assessment. We're talking about significant things, significant risk. We are expected to do a suitable and sufficient assessment of things and record the significant outcome from that, not trivial. People talk about trivial risk quite regularly. We are not being asked to judge trivial risk. So you may work in a lower risk industry. The things I've talked about today may sound alarmist and not relevant to you. But what I'm talking about is the regulatory framework is there to protect everybody. Everybody is exposed to some form of risk, but the assessment of that risk has to be suitable and sufficient, and it should be recorded what the significance is. If you work in a low-risk industry, say you work in an office, and you want help, the Health and Safety Executives page has great guidance on office-based risk assessments. For example, shop-based risk assessments. So you can find the help that you need in those sorts of places. I'm going to finish. I'm going to pose a question after listening to what I've said. Can you seriously say that the drop in deaths and injuries suffered by the common worker would have dropped at the rate it has without regulatory intervention? Can all employers or other vested interests be trusted to do the right thing through their own goodwill and voluntary mechanisms alone? Thank you for listening. Before I go, I'd just like to remind people to subscribe to us on your favourite media player, if you've not already done so. And if you have a spare 5 minutes, please leave us a nice review. 5 stars would be fabulous. It helps us to reach a wider audience, the review process. As always, if you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Or just drop us a comment on the media player. We really want to hear from people. We're interested in what you want to hear about. So please let us know what topics are of interest. That's all from me today. Thanks for listening. We'll catch up on the next ISO show. Goodbye.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.